Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talkward. I'm Marty Dundix, editor-in-chief of Weekly Humorous Magazine, and this is Talkward, a fun little podcast where professionally funny people come to tell awkward and cringeworthy stories. I'm very excited about today's guest. He's an amazingly accomplished comedy everything, from early on in the UCB world to stand-up comedy to writing for television and all kinds of hilarious animated shows. And also a podcaster for over 13 years with his long-running show, The Long Shot. Please welcome the very funny Sean Conroy to Talkward. Hello, Sean.
Hey, Marty. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful intro. I really enjoyed it. I love the jack of all trades, master of none aspect of my comedy career, which I think is real. I'm still trying to master some things.
The older I get and the longer I've been in this world of entertainment and media, I feel like we've all just been jack of all trades for such a long time. Like there's almost no opportunity when you even get into this world. There's almost no opportunity for them to be like, this is the one thing you have to be good at.
Right.
Have fun with this one thing, and everything's going to be fine. That never happens. It's like, oh, you're going to come do this. You're going to carry a bunch of boxes for a while, and then you're gonna answer some emails. You're going to call people, and you're going to bug people, and then you're going to do this, and then you're going to learn how to do video editing, audio design, lighting, and then you're going to do comedy writing, and then you're going to be on camera. It's never just one thing.
And I feel like if anybody asked me to do any of those things now, I would really be great at doing any of them. I'm just waiting for the right person to ask me, and that's not happening. So.
But wouldn't we also get bored if someone was like, here's this one thing that you get to do now? Don't you get,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like there's so many people in this creative field where we don't want to do one thing. Like, we want to be funny people, and maybe that's the only thing we want. We want everyone to kind of, like, laugh at jokes that we tell or something, but there's always more to it. Like, there's always... I think being a creative person makes you want to do like everything, whether it's photography or design or whatever. It's like we have to be sort of in control of too many things.
Right. And when I started out, I really thought I wanted to be like a comedic actor. And having done some of that, not a tremendous amount, I can't imagine if I had spent my entire life doing that, how I would feel so unfulfilled, I think. Because so much of the fun to me is creating stuff as opposed to and I'm not trying to go after actors in any way, but like you're executing something that somebody else has already come up with.
Exactly. You're at their you're at their you're at their whim. You're at their beck and call, or it's up to them to tell you what to do, which is why a lot of actors, I feel like, go into creation of their own projects because they get sick of waiting for a great project.
So much waiting. I mean, I think it's an old Spencer Tracy quote where he says, they pay you to stand around the acting you do for free, because it is so much waiting for them to tell you what to do, which I had no idea when I started,
So when you started, going way back, you were a New York City teacher.
I was a public school teacher in 114th Street and Frederick Douglass Boulevard in Harlem. I was a junior high school science teacher.
But going back even more than that, where did you grow up and where did you go to school?
I grew up in a city called New Rochelle, which is about a half hour north of New York City, the Queen City of the Sound. And I feel like it's funny because I have a big family and some of them still live there. and they talk about the people of the town and people who've lived there all their lives and whatever, as if I'm going to be familiar with those things.
Right.
But I kind of left there when I was like 13 or 14, only because I went to high school down in the Bronx, and then I went off to Massachusetts for college, and then I moved to the city. So I'm not familiar with New Rochelle as anybody that I
Where did you
lived
go
with.
to school in Boston?
I went to school, please, not Boston, Worcester.
Oh, you were. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I went to Holy Cross College.
One of my very best friends lives in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I went to Syracuse with him, and he's such a funny guy, and we worked in radio together, and he currently is the GM of the Worcester Bravehearts baseball team, which is
Well,
a Futures
yeah,
League baseball team that plays at Holy Cross
they've really
at
Worcester
Finton
has really
Field.
come up. Fitton Field, you're
Finton
exactly
Field.
right. Yeah. So your friend probably knows that every important city has at least one college. Worcester has 10. That's one of the billboards on the 290 as you drive, or was, many years ago. But yeah, I went to Holy Cross with Fitton Field. Also the school that some American luminaries like Clarence Thomas and Anthony Fauci went to. So, some good, some bad, or however
Yeah.
you look
There's
at
a
that.
mix. There's a mix.
Yeah. And then I moved back from Massachusetts to New York and was thinking that I wanted to be an actor, but also had to have a practical, real life existence. I was one of those people, which I think a lot of people are, that grew up knowing that you were never going to make a living as an actor or as a creative person of any kind. So you have to, it's fine to have a hobby, but you have to have the way
But
that
I mean, you're a very talented guy. You have been a character actor, comedic actor in many projects. When you first
Mhm.
came to New York City, you got yourself involved with the very early beginnings of the UCB.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
mean, and that was even a few years after I started doing, because I as an actor, I was like, oh, I got to read. I don't know if you remember, but back then they had actual newsprint publications that you could get a hold of and leaf through. And there was one called Backstage, which had auditions in it. You could say,
mhm.
like, we're looking for this type of person, and you could go in and audition for it. And I found an ad in Backstage that said, do you think you can be funny on the spot? And I was like, this person was writing this just to me. They're looking for me. And they said, bring a photo and a resume. So I walked in with a 3x5 photograph of myself in front of a mountain in Switzerland and a resume of all the jobs I had had through college. I was a bank teller, an assistant mechanic in a garage. I worked in a pizza shop. I was a deli counter guy. So that shows you how prepared I was for an acting career in New
Yeah.
York, that I didn't even understand what picture and resume meant when I was going on this audition. But anyway, that's how I started improvising, and did a lot of that for a long time. And then UCB came to town, and I really started working with them.
And so, for people who are, I'm sure everyone watching this is familiar with the difference between different comedies, but improv is mostly a team of people performing together,
Right.
and they start a scene or they start anything, and they haven't scripted it out. Nothing is planned, and it's usually coming from a suggestion from the audience, and then from that one suggestion, this entire show happens.
Right. Well, and to get even more into the weeds, Marty, there are two schools of improv. There's the short form improv school and the long form improv school. And the short form is where you do sort of quick games and you get a bunch of suggestions from the audience, and then you do a scene for 5 or 6 minutes. Then you end that scene, and then you do another scene, like whose line is it anyway? Kind of.
Whose line would be short form games,
Correct.
right?
And then there's long form, which is you take one suggestion from the audience and you go for half an hour, or 40 minutes, or 45 minutes, and just create as you go along. And so I had done a ton of short form, which I really enjoyed when the UCB came to town and they were doing long form. And I saw one long form show of theirs, and it was like a mind blow. Like I was like, you can do that. I want to do that. And that's when I started working with them.
It's an amazing thing to watch. I've always been in awe of it, and I've always been a huge watcher, but not participator of the improv. Like I've been in New York for 20 years, and I spent all of my aughts hanging out at shows at the UCB next to the Christidis,
Oh yeah,
going to the
very
Ass
familiar.
Cats, going to
Hmm.
all those, sitting there with the PBR. It was
Yep.
the cheap beer was the PBR. You could sit there
You're
with the
bringing back
PBR.
so many memories, Marty.
And I always just watched and enjoyed, and I watched so many talented people. I'm sure I saw you on that stage, and I would also go to a lot of stand up. I was a huge stand up comedy fan,
Hmm.
and I had friends that did UCB, and I had friends that went to the classes, and I would go to the graduation shows on Saturday mornings, and I would watch. And it was always kind of magic to me because I didn't understand any of the fundamentals on how they got any of the stuff to happen. Like, they,
Right.
all the different like people were so good at playing off of each other, and
Hmm.
the concept of yes and how you have to, you don't stop, the momentum, or you don't change things. You have to go. So, like, what's the main rule if you were to teach me how to do improv right now and I was thrown into a group? You would say just agree to do everything, or
It's yeah, it is a tricky thing because that is the main rule of improv is yes and, but that doesn't mean you have to, if somebody says something crazy, that doesn't mean you have to go, yeah, that's true. You can yes and the reality that I mean, this is where it gets so, it takes, I mean, that's why classes exist, is because you have to go through this a bunch of times. But it's okay to go, wait a minute, we're living in a reality where what you just said is not true. So it's okay for me to say, hold on, can we think about this and talk about this for a
hmm,
second? And when people are first starting out, I mean, I'm sure it was confusing for me to just try to explain it in like two sentences. But when people are starting out and they're told you have to yes and everything and agree and move forward, it confuses the hell out of people. And people
yeah.
get so caught up in the worst thing you can do when you're improvising, which is thinking about what the next right thing to do is, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I was to tell somebody if they were going to start improvising, thrown into a group of people, my first thing would be just listen carefully to what everybody's saying and what they mean and what's implied and what's there, and use that,
It's like a trust circle come to life
Yes,
with jokes. You know,
exactly. And a
it's like
lot of falling.
you got to
Yeah,
catch
yeah,
people when they're constantly falling,
right,
and
right,
saving them, and then moving things along.
right.
I'm always impressed with the person that picks who is the one who says and like does who says this is over now at that joke, and then they run across the scene as a way to change scenes. When they do the little jog,
The,
they do
the
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 jog.
sweep edit, we call that the sweep
Yes,
edit.
the sweep edit. I
And
like.
editing is hard because people are killing on stage. They're doing so well, and you're on the back line, and you're like, are they going to be mad at me if I end this scene? Like,
Yeah.
it's a thing that takes a while to develop.
You wait for
Um,
the. You're like, they're not going to get a bigger laugh than that
right.
laugh
You
over.
hope you pick the right moment. Yes,
Yeah,
you want to edit at
because
a
you want
high
to be
point.
out on top. You want to wait until they
Hmm.
get to that on top moment.
The
So you
worst thing
come.
is when you go past that moment and then they keep going and they have nothing, and then you have to edit because you've managed to allow them to suck all the life out of the show,
Yeah,
which happens more
show
than
is
you would
over.
like.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So you're doing the high school. You're a junior high science
Junior high
teacher,
school. Yep.
and you are at the same time doing comedy at night.
Right.
So you're doing the high school science teacher or junior high school science teacher thing while performing at UCB.
It Well, no, I was out of teaching by the time. So I taught for 6 years,
Okay.
and I was working with an off Broadway show called Chicago City Limits. I was in their national touring company. Now you might think it's a bit of a conflict to be a full time public school teacher and to be in the national touring company of an off Broadway show, and you would be exactly right. So what I would do is I would teach all week. I was also in graduate school at the time and running an after school program every week.
So
But I would teach
exhausting.
all
How
week.
did you do all of this stuff, Sean?
I was in my 20s. I didn't know any different. It was
Ugh.
just like, and then I would do shows. We would have shows in town on Monday nights and out of town on Saturday nights. So I'd work all week. Saturday morning, I'd get up and fly to Michigan or Illinois or Ohio or wherever, do a show Saturday night, fly back on Sunday, go to work on Monday morning. It was insane. And eventually, obviously, I had to make a choice. And the choice was, do you want to continue to make a decent living as a school teacher, or do you want to take a chance and go comedy full time? And obviously, that's what I chose, and I've been regretting it ever since. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
So you jumped in full and you did the comedy. And when did you get yourself involved with the UCB folks, which
So
was
that was like it
the
was like
very beginning?
a year later that they came to town. I think it was a year after I stopped teaching that UCB showed up in town, and I was still working with that other group because the other thing was with that other group, that off Broadway show, if you were in the National Touring Company, you could have the opportunity to be promoted to the off Broadway show and get to do 6 shows a week and make your living as a performer in New York City. And that was kind of my dream. And then I started working with UCB, and I basically got into the resident company, got my shot, did it for a week, and was like, I don't enjoy this anymore. And I quit that too. I'm a quitter, Marty. That's what I'm saying. I quit my teaching job. I quit my off Broadway show. But by then I was so hooked on the UCB stuff that that's all I wanted to do, you know?
Well, it seemed like their enthusiasm for starting that, and they all came from Chicago, right?
Correct.
So they all came from Chicago. They had probably been doing Second City.
They had been doing a variety of things. I think some of them had done Second City, several of them had done Improv Olympic, one of them had done the Annoyance Theater, but they had formed this Upright Citizens Brigade group, and they had sort of made a decision that I mean, who knows what the truth is, but the legend is that they got together at this particular diner in Chicago and said, we have to move either to New York or to LA because we think we should have our own TV show. And that night they decided they were going to move to New York, and they did that with the intention of getting a show, but they were also going to support themselves while they were in the process of getting that show by doing improv shows and sketch shows, and then eventually getting people so into it that they would start taking classes, which is what I did.
Yeah.
And then they got their Comedy Central show out of that, you know?
And that was a great show. That the UCB, the Upright Citizens Brigade Comedy Central show was so unique. I was in, I mean, that was like late '90s, mid '90s, late '90s.
Late 90s.
And there's one skit that I always think of it, and I don't know if anyone remembers the skit. I think it was is it Ian Roberts?
Mm-hmm.
He was talking to a group of people, and he would say, "Oh, you think you're so important. You've had my ass pennies in your pocket all day. You're
That
walking
is
around
one of the all-time classics. Yeah.
with my ass pennies. Every
Yeah.
day I shove this many pennies up my ass, and then I take them out. And
It was a brilliant sketch.
ridiculous. And
Yeah.
for some reason, that sketch stayed in my head. It stayed in my head for years. And
Yeah.
it's like I literally think of it every time I see pennies. I think
Right.
as pennies because of that skit.
It's a brilliant sketch because it's really it's done in such a way that you look at it, and if you pick it apart, you can see the mechanics of how a sketch works, in that it takes a really simple idea and then applies a rule that Ian always talks about of like, if this is true, then what else is true? So if I put X number of pennies in my ass every day and then put them back into circulation over a period of, like, it's a math problem basically, over a period of time, how many are there in the world, how many people are touching pennies every day, the chances are this, that you have had a penny in your hand that has been in my ass. And that's just his way of leveling the playing field with other people, is to be aware that they have probably touched a penny that's been in his ass.
It was wonderful. It was great logic. It's like
Yeah,
you don't
that's
have
the fun of
power
it.
over me.
Yeah,
You have
yeah.
my ass pennies in your pocket.
It's like a weird idea taken to a really extreme level in a way that does have logic to it, you
Yeah.
know? And again, to go back to that idea of yes and, it's like if somebody said, I have been putting pennies in my ass every day, there is a scene, a version of that, where somebody goes, that's crazy. You need to go to the doctor and get yourself checked out because you're insane. That doesn't help the scene. Whereas
No.
if they go, why would you do that? And the person starts to explain and gives more and more logic,
Yeah.
it becomes an all-time classic sketch.
It's great. Now, I accidentally said skit instead of sketch.
How
Now,
dare you?
I know. Now, tell me and folks watching why people do get very upset if you flip those words, because to normals, to the normies, it's like, who cares?
Right.
But it's not skits, it's sketches. And what is the difference and why?
I think that's such a good question, and all I can tell you, well, I'll give you my own take on it, but I also feel like I would be like, don't call it a skit, call it a sketch, but I don't really know why. It just bothers me, you know? And I think one of the reasons is because when I hear skit, the connotation to me is like some little thing that you and your Cub Scout troop slap together where you pretend to wear wigs and be the Beatles or something, you know, like it just feels like a minimizing term. Like, yes, you and your friends go do your little skits in the backyard. Whereas a sketch has a connotation of like you're creating. I mean, you know, sketches when you
Right.
really work on something and you try to like develop something and make it into something, and it has an actual image and it's an artistic choice, and you know. So I don't know what the truth is, but
That's
to
a very
me,
good. That's a very good reason that you just gave me, though. With the using the word sketch as a drawing, I definitely, as someone who
right?
has a drawing background, I
Uh-huh.
do understand that it is very different, and I think that makes all the difference.
But either way, it's one of those things that was, I feel like the skit sketch thing was a thing that belonged on Twitter before Twitter existed,
Yeah.
where it's like, who really cares? And yet people, myself included, would be like, don't call it a skit. It's a sketch, you know?
So
You're
when you
not taking
first,
what I do seriously.
you're definitely, absolutely, your little skits that you do on your weekend trips with your little church group.
Right?
Yeah, totally,
Right.
absolutely. No, you're right. So
And
when
by
you
the way, we
started,
did have our theater was in the basement of a church, just so you know, that show that I was in the National Touring Company in.
there you
It
go,
really
the
was.
National Touring
Yeah.
Company.
Hmm.
The different, well, also now that we're talking about the improv a little bit, there is the Groundlings, there is Improv Olympic, there's Second City, there's UCB,
Hmm.
and how are the methods of improv of different theaters like that different?
I
And
think that's a really.
are
I
they
think
like
that's a
different
really.
languages of comedy?
I think so. I honestly can't really speak to that, only because my whole experience has been Upright Citizens Brigade.
Have you been
I
to a
mean,
Groundling show out in Los Angeles and you've been like, I don't really understand what they're
this is
accomplishing
not
here.
comedy.
What is this? Going this little.
No, my sense, and this is just a
You said,
sense.
you know what? This is a skit.
uh, there's a whole, again, it gets very confusing and very into the weeds, but there's a whole philosophy underlying what happens at the Upright Citizens Brigade, which is the game of the scene. Like, what's the most interesting, unusual thing in the scene, and how do we find a way to explore that and heighten that? For example, I put a penny in my ass. How do we explore that and how do we heighten that? Well, I do that every day because it makes me feel powerful. How does it make you feel powerful? Because I've done it for 6 months, and that means every day I put, then you're heightening the scene.
Yeah.
My sense is that the groundlings are more interested in what's fun about this particular character. And
Okay.
so you get some big, crazy, fun characters, which you also get at UCB, but that's not the focus. The focus
Right.
is what's the most interesting thing. And if you're going to do a big, crazy character, you're going to have to earn getting to that from some logical thing in the scene. Whereas I feel like in the groundling stuff, again, I'm talking about stuff I know nothing about, but I saw a couple of shows there, and I know who some of the performers are who came out of there.
Well, it
Who,
seems like there's SNL people that
right,
have a background in Groundlings, maybe, because it seems like certain SNL people that come to SNL have characters that
correct.
they've been perfecting for a long time.
and they kill because they're great. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're exactly right. They're like, these are my 7 characters I do. I'm going to do them on SNL. Then while I'm at SNL, I'm going to learn how to do an impression of Nikki Haley because that's relevant to what's going on right now. Right. But that's not something I perfected. It's like, this is somebody I knew as a kid who always struck me as weird, and I picked out what I thought was weird about them and heightened that aspect of the character, and that's what makes the character really fun, you know?
Yeah.
And I think, to me, that seems like that's what the focus of the Groundlings is. And as far as the other ones, I'm not even sure I could speak to that because I'm not as familiar with them, you know?
Yeah. But you're still doing a lot of UCB stuff in Los Angeles. You're based in Los Angeles.
I am, and yeah, I perform over there. The ASCAT show is gone now. UCB is the original UCB themselves are no longer involved with the theater. So ASCAT is over, but they have a new show called Elefante, which is the sort of successor to ASCAT.
We have that in New York. It's called Rat Scraps.
Uh-huh. And so it's done in a similar way, and I perform on that show fairly regularly. So
I think the UCB just made an announcement that they were coming back to New York City.
That is definitely in the works. I don't know how long it will take. And just to be clear, we're talking now about the brand, not the UCB themselves. Like, in other words, the brand is now owned by somebody else. And the UCB, the original 4, are not involved anymore.
The original 4 sold it.
Correct.
Do you know who they sold it to?
I should, because that's who I work for now, but I have a hard time. They sold it to a couple of different entities. And I can tell you that one of them is a hedge fund that also owns at least part of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And that really makes me laugh because my concept of hedge funds is that they are all about making money. And my concept of improv is that it is all about not making money. So the idea that somebody who wanted to make money would go out and get a hold of an improv theater, I mean, maybe they see something that I don't see. So I hope it works out for them.
Well, that's what I always kind of wonder, too. Also, people, these large, big conglomerates will come in and they'll buy newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, and then a year goes by, and then like maybe the newspaper goes out of business or they fire everybody, and they're like, well, it was losing so much money. It's like, well, that's because people that own newspapers are crazy rich people that just lose money every year, and it doesn't matter because owning publication things never makes any money. It's about owning influence. It's not about owning something that's going to make money. It's about something that you buy something and then you can tell people to do something and then whatever.
Right.
But like the newspaper doesn't make any money. So, but with UCB, I mean, the UCB system, like the comedy world, it's a comedy machine. So the UCB classes make a ton. I mean, a lot of people take these classes.
Right.
And they want to learn how to do comedy. Like, there's no comedy college necessarily.
No.
Like, there's a couple of small
I think
colleges.
there is like a program in a couple of places at this point.
Right. At this point, there are places. Like, I remember, I think, like, Eugene Merman at...
That's the famous one, is that he designed his own major and made himself a comedy major, which I'm like, why didn't I think of that,
Exactly.
Brilliant.
It is brilliant. But I mean, UCB has a legitimate system of teaching comedy, at least teaching comedy in a way that's like repeatable, and getting people honed to a point where if they have a talent, they can find the talent and refine that talent, and if they really want to keep at it, there is a system, or at least there was a system where you would be seen often enough that the right people would be at those shows who were casting directors, agents, Lorne Michaels, people doing TV stuff.
Steve Spielberg, I call him Steve because we're on a first name basis.
That's so nice for you. Look at you, Mr. Big Time.
Yeah.
Los Angeles. But I mean, that's not hard to, that's not easy to come by, building a system like that. So all these places now, because UCB disappeared for a while, and then in their absence, a bunch of little places did pop up in New York City, at least. There's a couple of places that had a lot of ex-UCB people that
Oh,
popped
really?
up. There was the Squirrel Theater, which is still going.
Hmm.
There's a couple of places. There's a Brooklyn Comedy Collective. There's a couple little places that do lots of little comedy. A lot of them are at this place called Caveat, which is in the East Village. Great theater, really nice. Good,
I've
like,
heard a caveat. Yeah.
it's nice. But, nothing kind of is the same to me because I'm old as that feeling of being in that dangerous. Well, no, there's Asylum took over the space that's next to the Gristides, but that
Hmm.
officially closed finally. I think the city
They're
made them
knocking it all
close.
down or something, right? Aren't they building condos there or something?
Yeah, they're knocking all that down.
The world is changing.
That was kind of a death trap of a place anyway.
Yeah.
But fun.
Back at it with affection, but yeah, it was a nightmare.
And it smelled kind of
Um,
weird. It
yeah,
kind of had a
always. There
smell.
was always stuff going on there. It was, yeah.
There's
And
always
the
water.
pillars were in the way. You couldn't
There was
see.
leaking. There was
Yeah.
water stuff happening. They had all kinds of stuff. Plumbing.
Um, but I think, I don't want to get into all the ins and outs of all the business stuff and what went on and all that stuff. But because first of all, I don't even know all of them. But you know, you're right about the UCB school and how it sort of became an institution.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, well, I think two things. I think a lot of people don't realize how much focus and determination and work it takes to build something like that up over time.
Yeah.
And I think that is to the great credit of the UCB themselves, is that because I was in New York, like I said, for 7 or 8 years before they came to town.
Yeah.
And there was nobody saying, we're going to help you get on stage. We're going to make things easier for you. We're going to give you a space to perform. We're going to produce your show. When I started improvising and wanted to do my own improv show, I had to wander around New York and find a theater, which I eventually did, a black box that would let me perform at 11 p.m. on Friday nights, that I had to rent for $250 a week, that I
Wow.
hoped I would get enough people in to sort of break even. And I
Yeah.
cut costs by having my 14-year-old brother at the time work the door and my parents sell cookies at the door, which they both had real jobs. And what were they doing at 11 o'clock on Friday night, coming into the city to help me out with this little show that I was doing? But it was all stuff that I had to do myself. And when
Yeah.
UCB came to town, they started providing this opportunity for people in an incredible way that I had never seen before. But I think over time, that started to really get taken for granted, that
Yeah.
of course I should be allowed. And then it got into this whole thing of whether people should get paid for shows, and
Yeah.
became a whole thing.
It became a whole
Um,
thing, and I understand everyone's viewpoints on everything,
right,
but
right.
to build a place where people knew to go there,
Yeah, it had a
people,
reputation.
you got
And
a
you
stage
were,
to perform on. Like
mhm,
they gave you an audience and a place,
right,
and that didn't exist,
right,
and that's that's great. And there's other places that have tried to do the similar thing, and that's great too. That there's many places to do that kind of stuff now because of what UCB did to get it going, to
right,
provide like a comedy haven for people to go and perform and learn a craft, and then get to perform on big shows on the weekends and stuff. It was fun.
right,
I loved him.
right. And there's also the school aspect of it, which is part of it. And it was great, I think, for people. But I think there also came a tipping point with that, where people were like, oh, all I have to do is take some classes at UCB and then I'll get on SNL the way that everybody else that takes classes does. And
Right. It's not quite that
it just
simple.
doesn't work that way. And that
Not.
made people resentful in a sense,
Yeah.
of like, well, what am I getting out of this?
Yeah.
As opposed to when I started doing it, where I felt like what I was getting was, this sounds so self-serving, but that's how I live my life, is in service of myself. That I just loved the craft of performing that way and getting better at it, as opposed to, this is what I want to get out of this thing,
Right.
And that kind of went
I
by
mean,
the
people
boards.
can you they gave them it gave people an opportunity to shine if they wanted to work hard and have a place to go and then use it to their career benefit and then leave if that's one. Like when I was in just starting out in New York, I got a job. I was working at Letterman. A lot
Hmm.
of fun people working at Letterman. A
Heard of
lot of
them.
stand up, a lot of comics, a lot of writers,
Hmm.
and improv hero Ben Schwartz was there when I was there, and he had just started doing UCB, and he was doing a show called Rejected Jokes, where a lot of the people that I was working with were writing monologue jokes for Letterman because they were pages and they were part-time people like me in the audience department, and they knew people that would be able to get the jokes into the
Right.
writers room, and then they would get accepted or not.
Right.
So a lot of the people that worked there were doing that a lot. They were getting jokes in, and then Ben made an entire show at UCB called Rejected Jokes. So it was just the jokes that he had been writing that were rejected. So we made a whole show about that. So we took all of this content that he was creating that wasn't going anywhere, and he created this whole thing for himself because of UCB.
Hmm.
Caught on, became a huge thing. He got tons of
Turns
opportunity.
out that Ben Schwartz guy has some pretty good ideas from time to time.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, he's turned. I mean, he got a start. He found a platform. He
Hmm.
learned got to kind of work things out, and then explode huge and full of talent, tons of projects, amazing stuff. Um, and that's just like that happens for some people. It doesn't
Right.
happen for everybody that does it, but
Hmm.
and it happens enough that people go there with this high hope of possible huge fame and glory and all that stuff. But it's a lot of hard work.
I
You
still
had
hope I can emulate Ben and get on. I want to be on Parks and Rec, and we'll
I
see.
think you'll get there. I
I
hear
don't know. We'll
that
see.
they're looking for a Sean Conroy type
Right.
to be on.
Yeah.
So you've had a podcast on for 13 years now called The
Yeah.
Long Shot. Oh,
Hmm.
first I also wanted to talk about your one man show.
Okay.
Tell me about the one man show. And you did the one man show at it was an HBO comedy festival.
The HBO Comedy Festival, which used to be a thing, is no more. Yeah, I wrote a show, and it was just a show about my experiences as a teacher. You know, I talked about what it was like to go into a school as a white dude who went to Holy Cross College in Massachusetts, and went into this all black school in Harlem, and what that was like my first year. And I think that a lot of times it's sort of become a familiar trope at this point that, like, you know you go in and you save people and you do your best and they get something out of it and whatever. And that was actually kind of the opposite of my show, because my show was basically everything was at least exactly the same when I left, if not worse than it had been when I got there.
You made
Uh,
things so much worse
yeah,
after being in that middle school. It was
but
called
that
junior
they,
high
but
or
that,
middle back then.
but that they had changed me in some way.
Did they change you in a bad way or a good way?
I think a combination of things. Life is complicated. But I did that. Yeah, that was a long time ago, and I did that at the comedy festival in Aspen, Colorado, which was an amazing experience.
And how
Just
many
because,
people? I mean, that's a big festival. The HBO Comedy Festival was a very big deal when it was at its like
yeah,
height
it was
and
like a development festival. Basically, it was that
yeah.
people
It
would
was like
go and
Just for
sort of
Laughs. It was
right,
like the way
right,
Just for Laughs is now.
and I had uh, I could go on and on about this stuff, but I had a manager at the time who was like, yeah, the show is great, but nobody wants to see a show about teachers, so we don't really have anything to show people as far as. And then you look at all the show, every show that's been about teachers since then, and I'm like, well, we could have developed something at the time,
You
but
ever hear of Head of the Class? I mean, kind of a big deal. Hello.
right. Uh, but it was great because I met some people. I mean, that was when I started to get some TV spots as a stand-up. I had only been doing stand-up at that point for like 2 or 3 years. So, and it was also, I mean, the way I look back at that Aspen Comedy Festival is that comedy is such a grind. Like, it's so, you're always in a theater that doesn't have a bathroom backstage, so you have to walk through the audience, or the seats are all falling apart, or whatever. And you go to the Aspen Comedy Festival, and you're in one of the most beautiful places in the United States, and you're treated like an artist the
Yeah.
entire week. And I was like, okay, this could be great. Like, this could be really fun. It's never happened since then, but that 1 week was fantastic.
And that's a big audience. Like, was that crazy intimidating to perform on that stage with that kind of a crowd?
I think by then I was no more intimidated by that crowd than I was by any other crowd. You know what I mean? Like, it never
Yeah.
occurred to me. This is going to sound, again, I'm just being so self-serving at this point, but it never occurred to me that after I did my show in Aspen, Colorado, and I was walking out of the theater, that Norman Lear would come up to me and tell me how much he enjoyed the show. Like, had I known that he was going to be in the audience when I went on stage, I might have had, heart palpitations, but
Yeah.
I didn't know that. And I just did it. And there he was and said something so nice. And I was like, holy smokes. I don't know if we're allowed to use the word smoke on this show, but I just did.
And Norman Lear, he's still doing stuff.
Still out there.
He's
still making stuff.
He's doing those live versions of his classic shows on television. He's still got his little hat. He's doing it. He's still making stuff. It's amazing.
Yeah, incredible. What a gift.
One of your cringeworthy stories involved being a teacher, being a science teacher, and it was for a class trip to see the Broadway show Cats in New York City.
Yes.
And now what happened? Now, when I was in middle school, we actually did go up to New York City. It was one of the most exciting things if you were in the band or orchestra.
Oh, those kids.
At middle school, if you took the band and orchestra, you got to go on the band trip, which was a trip to New York City. I grew up in suburban Maryland, overnight in a hotel.
Nice.
Coach bus.
Right.
We went to go see the Phantom of the Opera.
Okay.
We went out to dinner at some fancy Chinese food restaurants.
Right.
We went to the Statue of Liberty. It was like a whole thing.
Yeah.
So, and you had to have like a certain, I think maybe it had to have a certain grade level or something. But so it was like people look forward to this. I was pretty much in the band in middle school playing saxophone very poorly just so I could go on the band trip because that was like, we want to do this. And it was very exciting. I had an amazing time. It was like, so what happened on your trip for your school trip?
So my trip was a little different because it's not overnight, although I did eventually take the kids I took some of my kids and a bunch of other, again, it was the choir that went on a competition down to King's Dominion in Virginia for 3 days, and I did not get to
King's Dominion. Are you kidding me?
I did not get to sleep for 3 days because I was patrolling the hallways of the hotel so that nobody would, burn it down. But I
loved King's Dominion. My favorite place to go growing up was King's Dominion. Beautiful.
Very early in my teaching career, before I knew anything, I was tasked with taking my students on a trip to see Cats on Broadway. And it meant that we had to do some walking from the subway from the school to the subway, from the subway to the theater. And I had to sort of keep them all together and in line. And that's always a tricky thing. And two of my students just had a problem with each other, a boy and a girl. And they got into a knockdown brawl on the street. And, it's one thing when you're in the school and kids get in a fight because other teachers or security guards can get involved or whatever. But I was out there by myself on the streets of New York City in the middle of the day. We were going to a matinee performance, and these kids were trying to kill each other, and I had to figure out how to stop this. And I did okay. The boy was somebody who I was sort of, friendly with, so I got him to back off. The girl would not stop going after him. So I felt like I had no choice but to physically restrain her. So I'm standing in the middle of 7th Avenue with my arms wrapped around this 12-year-old girl who's screaming at the top of her lungs as people are walking by.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking to myself, what are these people, like, what's going through their minds? But I can't let her go because she's going to attack them and it's going to start all over again. And at that exact moment, we all heard this sound that I sort of could not believe what it was. And I was like, is that? And it was a galloping white horse. No bridle, no saddle, no rider, came sprinting, I guess not sprinting, galloping down 7th Avenue past us and then disappeared around the corner. And we all just like watched it go. It was like a miracle. Like we all just watched this horse run down the middle of 7th Avenue and disappear over to the west side. And that was it. The fight was over. We all just pretended nothing had happened, and we went and we watched Cats, and everything was fine.
We're like, well, because of this magical intervention, I think we're all just going to take a break and go watch Cats.
It really feels made up. It feels cinematic to me,
Yeah.
But it really happened, you know. And had that horse not come by at that moment, who knows what could have happened after that.
Well,
Then we went to watch Cats, and I looked. You know, I was like, oh, we're seeing a Broadway show. You guys are going to love this. It's amazing. It's incredible. Now, I will say Cats, not my favorite, but I looked over and all of my students had their hoods over their heads and were asleep for the entire show. You know?
Oh, come on. There's magical Mr. Mistopheles. There's memories.
It
There's
is
a lot of good.
Weird show.
It is a weird show.
I don't understand how it was on Broadway for as long as it was because it doesn't make any sense.
We loved it growing up. My sisters, we would all dress up in little cat outfits and we would dance to the soundtrack that we would play at full blast. I don't know why we loved Cats so much, but we loved Cats. And as an adult,
very successful.
People talk about it and they like make fun of it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Isn't Cats like the greatest show in the world? And they're like, no. And I'm like, it's not? Like, I thought it was amazing, but I haven't really revisited it since I was like 6 years old. So it's possible that things have changed since I've gotten older.
I guess, but I also, like, I went back just not long ago, right before this whole pandemic thing started. I was trying to develop another one-man show, and I was coming up with stuff that I would put in the show. And this is one of the stories that I felt like was fun to talk about. So I did a lot of research on Cats and where it was and what it was about and all this stuff. And I was like, it just blew my mind. Like, it made no sense that this ever became anything. And yet somehow it was, for 20 years, the biggest musical on Broadway or whatever, you know?
Doesn't make any sense.
I still don't, because I really feel like if you go back and listen to it, you'd be like, oh yeah, what were we thinking? We were kids. We had no taste.
Yeah.
You know?
I've been doing I think a lot of people, when we get to be a little bit older, and you can tell with television and movies that people who are maybe in our generation are now rebooting things from their childhood that they missed. Like, there's a lot of nostalgia happening because people in their 40s are looking back on what they loved, and now those things are all coming back again, or things are things are being done, and it's going to be like set in the 90s or something like that.
Right,
just because people's. So I was going back and watching some old cartoons and stuff because I feel like the kids don't have Saturday morning cartoon like they used to have Saturday morning cartoons, right? They have things on streaming, they have things on Netflix, but they don't have like ABC cartoon lineups or whatever it used to be that we would always watch. And you've done 2 different cartoon shows. They're adult animated shows. You did the Gentleman Lobsters and you did Mr. Pickles.
Right.
And you were head writer and showrunner, executive producer on these shows.
Yeah, and got to do voices on both of them too, which was really fun.
I just binged watched Gentleman Lobsters. If anyone's watching this and listening to this, you got to go watch Gentleman Lobsters because it's so funny.
Where did you find it?
On GQ. Yeah,
okay. So yes, I forgot about that. No, so those GQ ones were the first ones they made before I was involved. That was before it was an actual TV show. That was made for, I think, just for GQ, you know? So those are shorts that are so fun, and I just love those characters. Like,
the characters are so funny.
Yeah.
They're so fast.
And it's such a simple style of animation, but that's also contributes to how funny it is.
Very.
Very, very, very silly.
And the ones that you worked on were on CISO, and are those not available to see anywhere anymore?
They're not. I don't think you can see them anywhere, unfortunately. And it really bums me out because, like I said, I loved that show and I was really proud of it. And to not be able to say to people, go watch this episode. I was just talking about one of the episodes last night because I just really enjoyed them, and I only ever talk about my own work. That's the other thing.
That's great. This is a great place to do that. So you worked on those shows, and
Yes.
do you have your own shows cooking that you want to get out there? Are you
I
developing
do.
any
I'm
ideas?
developing a bunch of stuff and trying to
Animated or live action?
Both.
Okay.
And I think that's the goal, is sell something of my own. And
What did you watch when you were a kid that were cartoons that you liked? Because I was going back to watch the real Ghostbusters, which was an animated show that was based on the movies, but it was for like 7-year-olds, right? But it ran on ABC or something in the Saturday mornings. And I watched them because they were on Amazon Prime. And so I was like, oh, this is on Amazon Prime. So I was watching them, and they are like fully formed half-hour adventure shows, but they're written in such a way that they could have been made live action for an adult audience. Like they could just be sci-fi comedy shows, but they were written for kids. But the jokes that I'm now noticing that I watched as a kid, and I thought they were funny, they're totally like not adult, like in a bad way, but they are for a more sophisticated audience, or they're related to the movie characters, the way that Peter Venkman is this character or Ray Stantz is this character. But it seems almost like an adult can watch this show, but it's a kid's show, and I don't know if kids have shows like that today. Like it's almost like we pander too much to the children, whereas when we were kids, the stuff that we watched was actually pretty normal. It wasn't really watered down too much.
Right. There was no, I mean, that was, I think maybe, well, you're younger than I am, but, when I was coming up, there was no like Nickelodeon or anything like that. Everything was aimed at everybody, sort of,
Yeah, like the Flintstones or the Jetsons, where it's like if you watch the Flintstones, and I found it on Tubi, and it's like, these are funny episodes.
Yeah,
like this is, and they're aimed at a adult audience, but they're not like adult dirty, but they were on like primetime television.
Yeah.
These animated shows, the Flintstones and the Jetsons, and they're funny. Like they totally are making, they're dated, but it takes place in prehistoric times, so it still kind of makes sense.
Right.
It was amazing. I fell down such a rabbit hole of like, I love the Flintstones voice. It's kind of like a Jackie Gleason, and I was like, who did this?
Right. It's
and
very
this
honeymooners.
guy,
Yeah.
Alan Reed. I'm like, who's Alan Reed?
Right.
And I was just finding all these people, and then I got really deep into all these voice actors. I'm like, these guys are amazing.
Yeah.
Like they were so funny, and there's like videos of them just talking, and you're just like, God, these guys. So you got to do some cartoon voices on the shows. What was that like? That sounds like it'd be amazing to do. Now it seems like now that's the best gig to get, is this animated cartoon voices, because you can do it remotely from anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I love doing the voices. It depends on the show, I think. Like a show like Mr. Pickles, doing the voices for that, I would be in a recording session for 2 hours, and I would come out and feel like I had been through a 10-round heavyweight fight. Like it was, because there's such crazy characters elevated to such a level, and there's always so much frantic stuff going on in the show that you're trying to get yourself into that frame of mind while you're in the booth recording the character, and it just becomes a little bit overwhelming, But it was fun. I loved it.
If you were to, because hopefully people listening to this are a lot of comedy writers or aspiring TV comedy writers, when you first started getting things out there and you were getting yourself to a point where you could be a professionally hired TV writer, what did you do to get yourself to be good enough where you could start sending out scripts or spec scripts or writing samples to managers to get managers, or to friends who worked at shows? And this, it's good to have a friend that works at a show, but it only works if you have the talent good enough to be like, pass this along to someone who can do something about it.
So I'm going to tell you the 3 things I always come back to when I'm talking to people about this stuff. And then I'm sorry to say this, but I have to get out of here.
That's great. It's a great way to end it. End it on a high note of helpfulness.
Right. Because I always, I teach a lot of writing classes, and I always start the first class by basically saying, you guys, I know what you're thinking. Your question, I know what question is in the top of your mind right now, and I'm going to answer that question. And I know that the question is, how do I get a job writing for television? and then I say, and it's so funny the way I do this. I wish I could really do it for real because I am really so funny in real life. But I go, here is, here is, here is all you have to do to get a job writing for television. And then I basically go through a lot of the stuff that we talked about today in terms of this was what I did my own career. I started here. I did this. I went here. I started working with these people. I got this. I met these people. But what it all boils down to is, I think, three things. And number one is the grind. Like, just keep working on stuff, keep writing scripts, keep writing jokes, keep getting up on stage and improvising. Whatever you want to do, keep doing that thing because that is how you're going to get better at that thing. And that seems fairly self-evident, but I think there's a lot of people who get very satisfied with where they are, and they're like, "I'm good enough. Why is nobody hiring me?" You know. So that's number one. The second thing is, and I really wish I had thought of this when I was coming up, because I think I squandered many opportunities. Maybe not. But the idea of the people you meet along the way are the people that are going to help you out later on. So cultivating relationships with people that you meet. My first TV writing job was for a show called Love Inc. on the UPN network. And I was hired for that show by the producers and the network people, but that was because somebody I knew had created the show and brought me into the writer's room when they were working on the pilot because he knew I was funny. And he was like, "Do you want to come in and pitch jokes on the pilot?" Which I was like, sure. I didn't even understand what a writer's room was at that time, but he brought me in. And then once the pilot got picked up, he was like, "Do you have a script sample that I can give to these executives so they can make a decision as to whether to hire you as a writer?" And, you know, as it happened, to go back to the first thing I said, I had been grinding on scripts for years by then. I had been writing, I mean, I make it sound like I wrote a lot, but over the course of like 4 years, I had written 6 spec scripts. And I really liked the most recent one I had written. And I gave him that, and he gave it to the producers, and that got me hired on the show. And the last thing that I think is key, and the first two, you know, you can control how much you grind, you can control how you are in relationships with people that you meet along the way. The last one is to realize that there's also always a luck factor, and there's nothing you can do about that except be ready for when luck comes your way by grinding and cultivating relationships.
Yeah.
So I think those are the
script.
three things.
Have the writing ready to
Right.
go. You know, it's not
Right.
like, oh, I have to go home and write a script now because I made this connection. It's like, no, you should have
I'll
already
have
had
it to you by
6.
Monday. Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's a whole thing that people do where they go, "This guy said he wanted a script, so I have to have it done in 48 hours." And it's like, okay, good luck. You're not going to
you're going to have
anybody
garbage
with that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. Thank you so much, Sean Conroy. I
Yeah,
really appreciate you
you're
chatting
welcome.
about comedy. There's a bajillion things that I could talk to you about, but
I
we don't
know.
have.
I feel like I want to keep going. I wish I could, but you know,
You know, there's always you could always be on the podcast again because
I would love
we can
that.
do
I
that.
really would.
And if
That
people
would be
want to
great.
listen to Sean talk for at least an hour every
At
week, they can tune
least
in to the Long Shot podcast, which
available
he
at
has.
all podcast places and on my YouTube channel, which is called Sean Conroy Gets Happier. A lot of people watch it on YouTube, which is funny to me.
The Long
but that
Shot,
is-
which has been running for 13, it's America's favorite audio diary.
Thank you. Yes, Marty, that's exactly right. America's favorite audio diary. What does that even mean? But we have fun.
It sounds
and that's
great.
What I care
I
about.
think it's
Yeah.
great. And everyone should follow Sean on different platforms. He's at Sean Conroy, and you can go
Yep.
to his website, SeanConroy.com. And if you're in Los
That's it.
Angeles, he could teach you how to write comedy better. So definitely.
I could do that. I could do that anywhere too, because now we're doing it all on Zoom. So
Okay, then it's available to everybody on the internet. I hope you
Yeah.
all heard that, and you contact
Yeah.
Sean, and he can make you a funnier writer and
Right.
performer, probably. I
Yeah.
guess. If you
Sure.
actually want to catch, I listened to a little bit of your stand up that I found on YouTube,
Oh, no.
and you're so funny. You're such a funny guy. You know, you're so
Thank you.
talented, and the writing and stuff. But the stand up is such a pure and difficult art form.
Yeah.
Improv, you have a group of people to help catch you
Right.
when you fall. Stand up, you fall by
Yeah.
yourself up there. And
I mean,
and when
that was why I started doing stand up. Really, was because I had been doing so much improv, and I realized that even if I was great at improv, if I was doing it right, I wasn't gonna stand out from everybody else. And I wanted to do something where I would get all the credit and I would take all the blame. And I love stand up. It's so fun.
your delivery is really good. You're very dry and approachable and unexpected. You
Thank you.
say you're up there and you can just tell that you're that quick guy that just says, and then it just turns, and then the audience just loves it. Because I just watched like a 5 minute clip, and I was like, that's hilarious. I wish I could watch more of Sean. So when I'm out in LA, I hope you're doing something because I want to come see
Yeah.
you.
Let me know. Let me know.
All right. Thank you so much for being on Talkward. Thank you for tuning in, listener. Listen to us and subscribe and Talkward, and listen and subscribe to the Long Shot Podcast with Sean Conroy. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. Bye bye. Bye,
Thank
Sean.
you,
Thank
Marty.
you.
That was so fun.